comments before we start, if I can.
Sure. It's your meeting.
I guess I'll allow myself to do that. When we did the I-405 toll setting, I recall all of the meetings, and they were hotly contested. And one of the things that we, even though we had split vote on the commission when we set the toll rate or the toll range, excuse me, it wasn't a toll rate. One thing that all of us wanted were frequent updates on what was happening and monitoring of how it was performing, both from a traffic management perspective and from toll collections. And we have been receiving those from you, Patty, and this was the first annual report, and monitoring may change after that. But today's meeting, we're, I think, going to be pleased with what we hear so far based on what our other reports have been, and looking forward to this. So, thank you, Patty.
Great, well, thank you. And for the record, my name is Patty Robstello. I'm the Assistant Secretary for the Toll Division at the Department of Transportation. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and present our one-year data that we have pulled together so far today. I also appreciate being here in Marysville. Makes my commute home easier than if it was in Olympia, so thank you for that. Also appreciated and Emmett Heath's comments. He touched on some of the things in my presentation, but to hear that community transit is seeing that reliable trip in the express toll lanes, it's great to hear from them on that. So we'll get started. The agenda, kind of what I want to walk through is I do want to touch on the master plan for 405. I know there's others listening to this and in the audience need to have some, good to have that perspective of where we were some time ago looking at 405. I want to talk about some of the data and observations that we have, and then kind of where we're at with future improvements. So the master plan, this project program really got started in the late 1990s. There was an EIS that was done in 2002. Really bringing a lot of the jurisdictions along the corridor, a lot of state and local officials, as well as the federal government, to the table to talk about what needs to happen to 405. And out of that came this master plan, which looked at adding more capacity to 405, but also looking at those other facilities that support 405. So there's local arterial improvements. You heard about BRT, bus rapid transit, community transit, but also with ST3, Sound Transit will be implementing bus rapid transit in the corridor. Improvements to other transit services. Managed lanes was identified in there as something we needed to accommodate, as well as other improvements to support other modes of transportation. I know a lot of people are interested in how come we haven't built the master plan, but a lot has been done with the master plan. Unfortunately, all the funding hasn't come to build the master plan, but as you can see on this chart, a lot has been accomplished. And as I stated with ST3, there's more coming, as well as the Connecting Washington program that the legislature passed will add more improvements to the corridor as well. Also wanted to note that when the master plan was under its development, its horizon year was 2020. And well, 2020 is not that far away. So a lot's happened from growth. As you can see here on this slide, growth in King County alone, 22% increase, Snohomish County, 27% increase. Job growth has occurred as well. And I'll note that this last year in the Puget Sound region, they've had the most growth really in this decade. And so it's really been amazing kind of how much growth, but a lot of that growth has happened around the 405 corridor. This slide here shows you the growth just on our state facilities that we've seen. So you can see the increase in volume on various roadways. So I-5 has seen a 2% increase. You see 520 seeing 3 and 4% increase. So that's demonstrating that we've got growth, we've got people moving into the area, we've got jobs that are moving, having people travel around. And you can see 405 has seen a huge growth, that 9 to 10% more traffic on 405. So let's go to the express toll lanes. There was 3 goals that were identified for express toll lanes. These aren't in priority. But I want to note that one of the key pieces was to give drivers new choices. The second one was to have a faster, more reliable trip in the express toll lanes. Just a reminder, the HOV lanes were failing. At times, those HOV lanes that were on 405 were performing worse than the general purpose lanes. We want to bring back that reliability to the HOV lanes. And then funding, because we're using pricing to manage those lanes, any residual revenue that comes from that can be reinvested back in the corridor. So how the express toll lanes work, here's this map here shows you the length of it. It's a 17-mile corridor. We went operational the end of September of last year. We started out 24/7, but as you know, we changed the hours of operations in March. So we operate 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday, and some holidays we are not in operations. As you stated, there isn't just a toll rate. We have a minimum of 75 cents. $10 is the maximum. That's for the good to go rate. It is dynamically priced though, so as traffic increases or decreases, that price adjusts accordingly, because our goal again is to make sure we provide that reliable trip in the lanes. We did change carpool designation in the express toll lanes. Previously it was 2+. It's now 3+ during the peak and 2+ off peak. So let's talk about the goals that I mentioned. So offering drivers a new choice. So part of, what we anticipated in giving drivers new choices, that there would be a ramp-up phase. That first year, people would be less likely to quickly jump into the express toll lanes. They'd learn about them, and that's something we've seen on our State Route 167. And when we talk to our peers around the country, they said it really does take a year for drivers to get familiar with express toll lanes. As far as choice, drivers may not use it every day, and we were pretty upfront and clear about that. Again, looking to around the country, most people don't use it every day, so we were setting that expectation. We also indicated that we thought the typical toll rate would be somewhere between 75 cents and $4. So what are we seeing now after a year? Our ramp up happened a lot faster. We're seeing 14.5 million trips in that first year. We had projected about 12 million. A lot of them came a lot earlier than we expected, so we saw utilization happening a lot sooner. As far as choice, 70% of the express toll lane commuters use the lane 1 to 5 times a month. So the majority of people aren't using it every day. And that new drivers continue to come and use the corridor. So 50,000 new vehicles just in the month of September we saw in the express toll lane. So some of that comes from people learning how they work and wanting to take advantage, new people moving into the area and wanting to use them as well. And our average toll rate is $2.50. So just to dive into the data a little bit more, these are toll trips specifically. The darker green bar shows you what we forecasted for toll trips. The actuals is that lighter green. And so what you can see is that clearly our forecasts were off. Part of that had to do with this expectation about drivers getting familiar with the facility. But the other piece is that growth, as I mentioned earlier, a lot more growth in the area, a lot more people are out on the corridor, and they're taking advantage of the express toll lanes. This chart breaks down the statistics on how frequently people are using it. So those first 2 bars on the left is that's about 70% of the users between 1 and 5 times a month. And 7% are using it essentially every commute day. I'll note though, in that 7%, that includes transit as well, and we know transit's out there every day utilizing the express toll lanes.
Patty, can I interrupt for just a second?
Sure.
Can you go back to that other slide?
Sure.
How do you know that 37% are only using it 2 to 5 times?
Because we know the transactions that are happening every day, every month, and so we can look
By
at
account.
by transponder
Okay.
and license plate as well. So if you're a license plate user,
Thank you.
you're welcome. This chart here you've seen before. This is showing how much people are paying in the express toll lanes. So the the bars that you're seeing are over the course of the year, so by far the majority of the people are paying less than $4. And yes, there are people paying the $8 to $10. I'll note that we do hit $10 now about every day, and that can happen in both directions. So southbound in the morning, we're hitting $10, and we're hitting it northbound as well. I'll also indicate that that's really driven by the single lane section, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. Also, you'll notice in that box there, we broke it down by each quarter and what's happening during the peak, so you can see what that average toll rate is. So you can see over time, as utilization grows, that average toll rate's increasing. So moving on to providing a faster and more predictable trip. So we expected that we would be able to provide a faster trip. We expected to move more traffic more efficiently, along with move more people. And that, one of the goals, objectives was to meet a performance standard of, or the HOV lanes, we're only meeting 45 miles per hour 60% of the time. Our goal is 45 miles per hour 90% of the time. So what we're seeing is that the express toll lanes are saving drivers 10 to 15 minutes. And as you heard from Community Transit, Transit is seeing that reliable, more predictable trip in the express toll lanes. We're seeing that express toll lanes are moving more vehicles per lane than when we had just the HOV lane. And we're also seeing that overall, when you look at all traffic, we're moving more people through the corridor as well. On the more predictable trip, we're in the express toll lanes, we are at 45 miles per hour 80% of the time. Now this chart, I know previously in past presentations we've shared with you a similar chart here. This is getting to speed versus volume charts. So, and unfortunately I don't have a pointer, but the way you read this is if each of those dots is a vehicle that's traveling through the corridor. The orange would have been the HOV lanes. So looking at the single HOV lane, traffic would be, if it's up at 70 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, you can get a lot more traffic through, but as more traffic gets into the lane, you start to get into congestion, and that you get breakdown. When you get breakdown in speeds, you start to process fewer vehicles. The blue dot there is looking at a single express toll lane. So in the dual lane section, if you just look at one of those express toll lanes, what this diagram is showing you is that we're moving more vehicles at a higher speed. So this is just trying to reflect that we are moving more vehicles through the express toll lanes, even when you just compare one express toll lane to the previous HOV lane. This slide here shows looking at all volume across all lanes. Looking on the left, southbound, we looked at what we call screen lines. So looking at one point in the corridor, all the traffic passing that point. Up at 527, we're moving 4% more vehicles at that location. At 522, it's 10%. You can see as you get down into the Kirkland area where we did add capacity, it's much higher with 16 and 15%. So just as a reminder, up in that north end section, we didn't add any new capacity, but even by not adding more capacity, we're still moving more vehicles. Northbound, for the most part, it's similar, where we have the two-lane section, which is at Northeast 10th and Northeast 53rd, got 18 and 14%. Up at 522 is 3%. At 527, we're not seeing that we increased our volume, and a lot of that has to do is that's our most congested area that we have, and I'll share some more on that in a few minutes. This slide here shows the performance metric of that 45 miles per hour 90% of the time. On the left, the first two bars are showing you northbound and southbound when it was an HOV lane, so you can see we were significantly below the 90%. When you bring those, average them together, it's 60%. We measured this in a 6-month increment, so from January through June of this year, we were at 91% for northbound and southbound combined. Looking at April through September, we are at 85%. So we have seen that we've dropped below that 90%. However, we're looking at a whole host of things to try to address that. We want to look at any operational things that we can further refine out there to bring that back up. So that's what this slide touches on, is we have seen actually, so when you compare it to when it was an HOV lane, it's 25% better. So it's above that 60% that we were before. But what's really driving the challenges we're seeing is that single lane section. It's only a single lane section. There's not a lot of capacity. With all the growth we're seeing up in that area, there's just a lot of demand that want to utilize that. And that's why we're hitting $10. There's so much traffic wanting to be in that express toll lanes. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of improvements that we're looking at to try to address how we can improve the performance in that lane. This chart here breaks down utilization, so use by month. And so what you can see is both southbound and northbound by month, kind of how traffic's using the express toll lanes. And you can see month over month we're seeing growth that's happening in there. There's some variability in there, but we continue to overall see growth happening. Previously, in my 9-month report was the first time we started talking about other trips. Before, we had been reporting on the trips for general purpose traffic as the full length of the corridor, and then we looked at just kind of the major segment, so 520 to 522 and then 522 to I-5. But we've broken that down into more segments. They're listed there, those bullets there are additional locations that we're looking at travel time in the general purpose. I'll note that continually in the northbound stretch, north of 522, we continue to have issues. The next couple slides, I'm sharing some of those segment trips, but at the end of the presentation, we have all of them there, so you're welcome to look at those. So this shows you southbound 405 from 195th to 85th, and it's the morning commute. The legislature asked that we report on not only the average travel time, but also what we call the 95th percentile, which is really the reliability factor. If you go to our website and look at trips, we give you that 95th percentile because that's, most likely you'll be able to make that trip in that time frame, knowing that traffic varies from day to day. So for this particular trip in the general purpose lanes, you'll notice that the months that we looked at, that the travel times have improved. This then looks the other direction, so going from 85th up to 195th. You can see early on, the first 6 months or so, things did improve in the express toll lanes. You'll notice in August that reliability factor did drop from the year before. We're still digging into the details, but I think a lot of that has to do with the congestion that's growing up in the north end, and it's just spilling back and having an effect on that particular trip. So this is our bad trip. This is the one that's most significantly been affected. This is from 160th up to I-5, so going through where we went from 5 lanes of traffic northbound down to 3. So we essentially added more capacity south, freed up some bottlenecks, and then we've now pushed a lot of traffic up to this north end. So that's why we're seeing a lot slower travel times in this section, is because there's just so much more traffic getting there much faster. But we have a solution for that, at least an interim solution. You heard about the announcement of the peak use shoulder lane that will be constructed from 527 up to I-5. We think that's going to help some of that congestion. We have so much traffic getting on from 527 in the evening. We think having this additional capacity will help that. How this works is that the shoulder will be opened up to all traffic in what we expect will be the PM peak when there is congestion out there. Our traffic management center monitors this stretch and will be able to open the lane up when they see that congestion is building. That's what you see with that green arrow sign, so there'll be dynamic signing out there that will let you know when it's okay to be in the lane or in the shoulder. And last week we did select the contractor, and all of this work is being done with toll revenue. So again, this is kind of one of those pieces about the express toll lanes, is the revenue we're collecting, we are investing right back into the corridor. So talking about funding, one of the goals was to take that funding and put it back into the corridor. So we are using that for this project next year to build the PQ's shoulder lane, but also in the Connecting Washington program. The legislature had identified, and there was actually recommendations made by the agencies along the corridor to build the rest of the corridor out with express toll lanes from Renton to Bellevue, and to utilize toll revenue. So they identified $200 million of toll revenue to support that. And so what we're seeing is we're able to do that project, this peak use project, peak shoulder use project, and we're also looking at other things that toll revenue could take advantage of as well. In particular, the legislature asked that we continue to look at improvements north of 520 or at 522 to the north. Preliminary studies have been done on that, and more information will be coming out on that. And happy to come back to present what that might look like and how toll revenue could potentially support that as well. Here's just goes over the things we've done operationally to make improvements to the express toll lanes. Mentioned earlier the change in the hours of operations, and we've seen that's definitely helped the weekend congestion we were seeing. We continue to monitor and make adjustments to the toll rate algorithm, striping and access changes at 9 locations, and we've done some signing modifications. Part of this project that's coming next year, there'll also be some additional striping and signing modifications as well. I wanted to bring this one up, calling it the Mythbuster, but it keeps coming up, so wanted to highlight this, that many people are concerned that all the toll revenue is going to a company in Texas. And this, what we're trying to show here with this pie is that only 9%, as we look at the last 6 months, 9% is going to the company that it's base operation. I mean, their corporate headquarters are in Texas, but they employ over 120 Washington employees in multiple locations here in Seattle and Bellevue and over in Gig Harbor. So it's local people being paid with the toll revenue. 31% is WSDOT expenses. We also pay for other services like state patrol and things of that nature, our adjudication program. And so 60% of, in this last 6 months, 60% of the revenue we've collected is what is available to be invested back in. And as the toll rates, as people pay more, if we're collecting more revenue, it's that money that's going to go right back into the corridor to help not only express toll lanes, but the general purpose lanes.
Just to be clear, this chart is for the 405 specific, not system-wide?
This is just 405,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
So all money on the 405 stays on the 405?
That's correct. The legislature was very clear that toll revenue that's generated in a corridor stays in the corridor. So to wrap this up, key takeaways, we are moving more vehicles and more people. We're providing more predictable travel times. We continue to use the express tolling user base, or continue to see the user base grow as more people are using it. Clearly we have some challenges with the single express tolling. That's driving the high toll rates. That's driving some of our delays we're seeing in the express toll lanes. And we are generating revenue that's already being able to reinvest back into the corridor. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Trained us well. I don't know if I have any questions beyond this. Is there anybody else? No. I guess not.
Okay, well, also, we like to hear feedback on our slides. If there's data that is confusing, if there's thoughts on how we can better describe this or other data you'd like to see, please let me know and we'll provide that the next time.
I just wanted to say that I think, like the Mythbuster slide, I think the more we can find ways to ferret out the facts and present them in simple terms, I think that was good. I think the emails that go out monthly now on the rates and when we're hitting, how often we're hitting $10 in the perspective or context of all the rates that are charged when the lanes are running is really important and good information, because you showed it up here, and I just think it's important to keep that context, because it's like we hear it hit $10, 4 days last week or whatever, and that seems like, well, that might be a significant meaning, but I think when you lose the context of how often, what time, on what segment, what was the cause, and you peel back that onion, and then see it in the context of all the rates within the range the commission has set, I think it's pretty clear that the range is working, and there's just a demand there and a structural problem with the corridor layout of between 1 and 2 lanes that is not a problem that's gonna go away probably anytime soon completely, unless we really see a huge investment in extending the system up to I-5. I mean, I think that's kind of the end of the day, is the ultimate solution. In the meantime, I think you guys are doing the best you can to kind of Band-Aid it through and give the public that option for travel that clearly a lot of people are taking advantage of. So I commend you guys, and I think it's just a tough message to sell when you've got, it's a complex topic and the data is deep. And it's really hard to boil it down into sound bites, but I think the numbers don't lie, that a lot of people are using it. And, we hear anecdotally all the time that people really are glad it's there as an option. It's not solving congestion, and I don't think anyone ever thought it would, but it's giving people an option when they need it, so.
Okay.
Can I have one follow-up question?
Sure.
More of a comment than a question. Looking at the percent breakdown by frequency slide, the 7% and 32, it'd be interesting to know what percent were paid trips or represent on that, to make sure clear that whether they're, you mentioned the 7% includes transit, but how many were carpools versus single occupancy vehicle trips, using it within 20 times per month, for example, or at different levels. Because it would help to know how many people are choosing to pay to use it that often, or are using it as a carpool option, or for example.
Okay, yeah, we'll see if we can kind of slice the data more on that.
Yeah, it's amazing. I get comments all the time that people get a gas that is charging $10 for a trip, and I explain to them it's only 5% of the time that people are having to spend $10 during the peak time, and so they really understand that a lot better.
Okay.
And thank you. You also responded to the one question I had several months ago about, what percentage of this funding really is generated by the higher tolls. And I think that chart, giving that breakdown, really answers that simply. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to open our public comment here in a second. We do have one that's signed in, so they would like to comment.
I'm still getting my thoughts.
Oh, we have 3. And the first one on the list is David Pavlowitz.
You can go first.
Yeah. Can I take a spot?
I'm still gathering my thoughts here, so
Yeah, I'm losing
don't,
my
I use
voice.
my
Okay.
time.
I'll try to do the best I can. Any
We
particular
have
mic, or do you?
Philip Scoot.
Yeah. And- Oh, yeah, sure. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice today. I went downtown by a very well occupied bus, and the guy behind me was coughing all over me. So I looked it up. The Center for Disease Control says that riding transit in the United States, because they don't have proper air filters, you have a 600% chance, greater chance of catching the flu. So maybe I've got it, I don't know.
Okay. I
Anyway.
forgot to mention, we usually during our public comment, we like to restrict the time. We
Sure.
won't count that against you.
Thank you, because I want to explain, I'm going to make me cough in the middle of this, all of your mind.
About 3 minutes is,
Okay, so I live at about 141st and 405 on the west side. 160th, I experience when I go northbound. I do business both directions. I do about 4 trips a day.
hate to interrupt one more time.
Yes.
For the record, we are recording. Can we get your name too?
Oh, Philip Scoot.
And I'll start your time now.
Well, thank you. I'm not used to public speaking. So I live in the area where the restrictions as you go northbound is very obvious. You see that. Southbound, it is a little bit better, but if you look at the charts, it's better because more real estate was added in that area. So these numbers don't really reflect the fact that additional lane capacity went in when the toll rates went in. they haven't separated the two. Northbound, they recognize now, and Judy Cleburne says, okay, fine, we don't need a hearing, we're gonna go hard shoulder running. I think that's a good idea, I think it's way too late. But let's use tolling now as an example of equity. If I was standing at Starbucks, and in the morning they're very busy at some other Starbucks, let's say there were 2 lanes, and I was willing to push the couples, the 2 pretty couples out of the lane, pay $10 to get my coffee first, because I happen to be able to write that off of my business. Let's say you're a Microsoft executive or something. Is that really equitable? Because we all paid for those lanes. And from my point of view, tolling is not very effective. What's effective is adding more real estate. I think we should focus on that and only on that. I lived in Europe many years, and turns out that they have much more effective ways of collecting money without all the overhead of this method. They do it once a year. If you ever violate the lane, you get a big fine. You don't have to have a complicated ultraviolet system that's trying to check on people's faces, all that stuff. It's a mess. Now, David's kind of a friend, and I, as a favor to him, I stood over the lane a bit and looked at people, and I noticed in the tolling lane, most of the cars have 1 person, not 3. So you reduce the capacity of the lane, push them to the other lane. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You ready, David?
I suppose so. Is this start like this? For me to get everything that I would love to say in 3 minutes is tough. But I want to say, before we jump into this, the previous presentation you had, Cascade Bike Club, remember? I attended their Advocacy Leadership Institute, and I am a strong advocate. I've been a bike team captain for the Bike to Work Month Challenge many times. So you know that I'm not just some guy who's trying to say the tolls are a problem, but here's why. And a few things that I think you might want to consider as you're hearing what their presentation covers is that you have 120 employees that you're employing. That's great. The downside is it takes 120 employees to handle all of the problems that we're having with billing alone. And they've actually had several million billing errors. I personally have been billed 5 times when I should not have been billed. I have no idea, we have no idea how many of those are happening. There, in the financial statement that was published, there were $2 million worth of enforcement and penalties issued for people. So think about that yes, we're collecting money and we're beating everybody up to get it. This is what the citizens are dealing with. $2 million that we're paying in penalties and law enforcement. When we say that it's reliable, when you include the cost, when we include the price of the toll at any given moment, it's actually not, because now you have a price unreliability that people have to deal with. And there's still the unreliability, that it still has problems, in spite of having the tolls go up and down. When they hit $10, it fails. And unfortunately, the social inequity part of this is those people that live in northern Bothell and live in Snohomish County, yet we might say that only 5% of the time, or whatever measure that you want to say, it hits the $10. All of those higher priced tolls are hitting the people who live in Snohomish and northern Bothell. So this is something to keep in mind as we're looking at the social inequity. They're taking the lion's share in the beating of this, as well as how long it takes them to get through that traffic. Freight mobility is another issue. We're finding that a lot of the freight is actually moving over to Highway 2, Highway 9, Highway 203, which are not intended to handle the loads that those trucks are carrying. So if you're seeing increases in the number of cars, it's because the trucks are out of the way, not because we're getting more cars through. 80% of the 80% of the people who are using the toll lanes have an income above the median, and that is from Patty's statistics. 80% of the people have an above median income. So social inequity is definitely here. And the fact that you're paying one way or the other, either you're paying with your time or you're paying with your money. And unfortunately, people who can't afford to pay with their money are forced to pay with their time. So consider all these factors and know that in the end, no matter how high you raise the toll, there will still be more cars coming. And the tolling is not what's going to relieve this problem. but giving us better methods of transportation will, and that would include making, instead of a rural highway, to make it into a urban highway. 2 lanes plus 1 is not an urban highway. So with that, I appreciate your time and your consideration.
Thank you, David. And Susan Gardner?
For the record, I'm Susan Gardner. I live in Kenmore, Washington. And I see that on the 405 master plan that if you would address a lot of those other areas that have about 50% completion, that you might be able to not resolve congestion, but help it along. I don't think focusing on tolling, which was even just a proposal, not even part of the plan, has now seemed to take precedence over how we approach I-405. And I really think that those of us on the east side are getting hit big time with all the tolls. We are the social experiment, and that's kind of irritating. I live in Kenmore. I can't leave my house during rush hour because of the diversion. What WSDOT seems to do is just do this very isolated view of what happens, and all of the roads are being impacted outside of that don't get included into that. So again, I have to think long and hard and maybe add, like, leave 2 hours early from my house if I want to go somewhere because I'm never going to get off my hill. As far as who uses the express lanes, the express toll lanes, vehicles don't equal people. All the 2 people carpools were kicked out during peak hour when they made it 3 people only. I noted in the October 13th Seattle Times, an article they wrote, they said that state data discussing an HOV lane on I-5 moves 5,000 people in the busiest hour, or 3.9 people per vehicle. That's the type of data that I think that needs to be, that we need to learn about, again, to say that yes, we're helping all the people, or no, you're really just helping those people that have the ability to pay.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that would like to comment on anything we've done today? Seeing none, I guess we will stand adjourned. Thank you.